President Trump threatens to pull funding from public schools that teach or implement the bogus 1619 curriculum. Good, it's about time we put a stupid tax on those who would lie about history for their own selfish ideological purposes. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we start with some good news in the academic world as President Donald Trump hugely announces that he'll look at pulling funding from schools that teach the New York Times radical and utterly debunked 1619 Project. Good. 1619 Project is nothing more than a radical revision of American history through the lens of Black Lives Matter ideology, which is really short on ideology and intelligence and real high on politics.
Well, I'm going to play the pessimist today as you play the optimist, because he says we could face a loss of federal funding, and maybe, and he's threatening, but when it comes to brass tacks, let's see if it actually happens.
Well, does he have the power to do it, is the question.
That's a good question. How about your local schools take control, but you won't? Anyway, the 1619 Project, if you've lived under a rock, it won a Pulitzer Prize.
A Plymouth Rock.
Okay, it won a Pulitzer Prize last year. It's been criticized pretty much by anyone who has a working frontal cortex.
Including many liberal historians at universities.
Oh, yeah. They're claiming that, the founding of America started in 1619. We got our first slaves. And it wasn't 1776 or anywhere near that. We're going to go way back, 150 years prior to that. And so they claim that capitalism, that's why we had the Revolutionary War. That's, and that's why capitalism is so evil and we must get rid of it. They said the founding fathers were all about just keeping slaves and the slave economy going. That's all they cared about. These documents they wrote, they don't care about that. So that's what's the 1619 Project. And now it's being pretty much rolled out and praised by all these schools across the nation is maybe we should adapt this curriculum nationwide. And this is how we should teach history to our kids. And so finally, President Trump, as he should have immediately, has come out and said, well, maybe if you start teaching that, yoink, we'll take some of your funding. Again, it's a threat. I hope it happens, but I don't know how much.
That's a Congress thing, not necessarily
a
president thing. But it's good that he says that anyway. I'm glad that he's behind it. And that begs the question, the Democrats control Congress, right? And they seem to have a pretty smooth margin here. It's not one of those things that if every Republican voted for it, they still wouldn't be able to necessarily get that done. But somebody's got to call this out. And this is not a Black Lives Matter curriculum. This is the extension of Howard Zinn's socialist curriculum. Yeah. And that's the beef that so many of us have with this. This has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. You're not ennobling one black life by pretending that 1619 somehow started the American story because, slavery. We have been teaching slavery at the expense of everything else in our kids' public schools for 30 years now. We have made the primary narrative of American history since at least 1970 about American tyranny and oppression. That's the Howard Zinnification of American history. That is the socialist narratives through which we look at schools now. And it goes to show you that the Black Lives Matter is nothing more than a shill for socialism. One of the major founders of Black Lives Matter actually was trained by a Weather Underground terrorist, trained to become a Marxist. They boast about their Marxist and communist bona fides. Forget the fact that communism has killed, as places like Cuba, has killed more black and brown skinned people than just about anything else. Forget that. This is now black nationalism being co-opted under the flag, like it has been since the 1960s, of communist radicals.
Pretty much.
Primarily white communist radicals.
And a little plug for Healthy Republic. If you take a look at my most recent Healthy Republic, it talks about the rads of the 1960s and how the rads of then and the rads of now are pretty much one and the same. But back to this story. As I said, the 1619 Project, the curriculum's trying to get implemented all across the nation. We already know California, New York, Illinois, and probably all the rest of the big states, maybe exception of Texas, have said, hey, we want this in our schools. They're pledging that they want to actually implement this as their history curriculum. So President Trump tweeted specifically about what's happening with California. He said, Department of Education is looking at this. If so, they will not be funded. And so it was a tweet that was specific to that. And we already had reported back in July, I think it was, sometime this summer, that Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, he has already drafted a bill that would actually prevent schools from using the 1619 Project curriculum. Because the other thing to remember about this 1619 Project, it was started by the New York Times editorial board, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who was a nobody, came up in a editorial board meeting and said, hey, how about we just make up a curriculum and say that the country started in 1619? And they're like, brilliant idea. And they went with it and now have a Pulitzer for it.
Again, not a historian. These weren't historians at a think tank. They were New York Times editorial writers about the most anti-American, pro-socialist group, prominent group in this country. And you have a young employee there with no historical training whatsoever, just sort of raised her hand and said, "Why?" This is a paraphrase.
That's kind of how it did.
Let's lie about American history hugely. Let's do that.
I don't think she did hugely.
Let's reframe American history through the lens of racism and sexism. That was just a new idea, no, but it's clever, right? Take 1776 off the books and go back to 1619, right? Although, the idea here that we weren't a British colony. We were a British colony from 1620, basically all the way through 1776. And why not go back to Jamestown? Why not go back to Roanoke? Why not go back to the explorations of Columbus himself? And that's what we saw in the latest riots in the streets when they decided they're going to go much further back. And I've said this many times, and I'll say it before, but let's do this with every culture. Let's go back to Native American culture, and let's go back to 800, the 800 Project, right? When in the space of one weekend, something like 400,000 Native American prisoners were sacrificed on altars by the Aztecs. Let's go back to that. Let's 1619 every country. Let's 1619 China, all the way back to its building of a wall to keep so-called barbarians out. Let's 1619 our way all the way back to those before white people started pulling slaves out of southern Africa when Africans were enslaving each other. Let's pull the program all the way back, but alas, this never was the point. The point is multicultural education, which means America is responsible for the world's problems, and every other culture is somehow inherently better. Even the British here, Hannah Jones says, well, at least they were in the process of getting rid of slavery. Oh, really? I thought, listening to you liberals, slavery never went away. Billion-dollar basketball players like LeBron James are enslaved by white owners. Hundreds of millions of dollars football players, right, are enslaved on the field by a racist anthem. And yet the British were in the process of dissolving this when Americans fought a war to keep it. It's just the most perverse skewing of history. It would be like going back to World War II and completely skewing the narratives about World War II only to one aspect of, let's say, Italian fascism. We're going to ignore everything. What you wanted to do is you wanted to use this new curriculum about World War II to make Italy and the Italians look bad. So you ignore Hitler, you ignore Japanese imperialism, you ignore everything else, and you just focus narrowly how on the Italians were responsible for this war. You freeze out everything else. You're going to do a great job teaching kids that Italy is bad, but you'll be ignoring the real Hitlers in the room, right? That's the problem.
I have some not breaking news. Our public school system is not about education. I know.
You would think that there was you'd think there was a show on a podcast that's been saying that for years, wouldn't you?
You would really think that.
Betsy DeVos has she's upped her game. She must be watching the Dr. Duke show.
Yeah, so Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, has actually joined Glenn Beck on the Glenn Beck radio show, podcast. He's pretty much everywhere. So basically, our schools have been teaching Marxist values for how long now? And our mainstream media, they don't care about any of it. But Glenn Beck cares about it. And so he had gotten 800 documents, not 800 pages of documents, but 800 different documents showing all of this. And it was kind of like leaked to him. So he did a little show about it.
The 800 files of school curriculum that were recently leaked from a teacher. We know this teacher is a black conservative. He received all of these from a group of teachers at a recent teachers conference this summer. And he started going over it and listening to everyone, and it scared the heck out of him. I'd have him on, but he is rightfully very concerned about the backlash that he would get. The cost to his family and his career is too high.
Yeah, what's so great about this story, it's a black conservative teacher protesting the 1619 mentality, right? I mean, and it's like he's ratting out the mob or something. Your public schools have become a mafia. They literally have become a Cosa Nostra, our thing at the expense of you. We're going to push our family. We're going to push the family, the educational family at the expense of your family. And now you've got somebody on the inside, African American conservative teacher who foolishly and bigotedly, we assume, would easily go along with this program, who's speaking out, but only under an anonymity and the witness protection program, because they'd kneecap this guy. They would literally kneecap this guy if they found out who he was.
And so what happened is Glenn had those 800 documents, and then he decided, you know what, U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, come on my show, let's talk about what's happening in our public school system. And so he had her on the show, and I'll show you a clip in a minute about it, but DeVos had said that parents today, all too many of them, don't have the opportunity to really control their kids' education, and therefore what they're learning and what their whole environment is. So now more than ever, today there's a demand, an increasing demand to give parents options and give them control of resources that are being spent on their children.
Yeah, not to dull the analogy, I want to reinforce the analogy. This is as if a group of special interest criminals, right, the educrats of America, progressive educrats, have hijacked, literally forced themselves into your public schools, demanding that the schools and the teachers unions are demanding that the schools and the teachers and the students pay this kind of protection money to the racket. This is a syndicate, right? And your parents have no say in this, the kids have no say in this. We've documented this from top to bottom with the radical sexuality, the bogus ignoring of American history, now the rewriting of American history with the 1619 program, as we just saw. All of this stuff's going on in the schools now. It is a criminal syndicate run by ideologues, and the rest of us, including moms and dads, are being held hostage. They have to pay exorbitant amounts of protection money to keep the racket going. And listen to what Betsy DeVos says about this.
It is a completely non-child focused agenda that's taken root in all too many districts across the country. And when you hear that, the LA Teachers Board says we're not going to go back to work until it's safe, quote unquote, and oh, by the way, until we have universal health care, until we defund the police, this is a time where I believe parents have got to raise their voices, not only with their local school boards, if that's where they want the outlet to be, but with their legislators to demand that they have that they can control the resources that are being invested in their children. They're paying property taxes, grandparents are paying property taxes, businesses are paying property taxes, and they should be able to say, we want something different, we want something better for our kids.
With all due respect, Ms. DeVos, I agree with the sentiment that you're trying to elucidate, but it's not that we have a non-child-centered education system. The children are the center of this. It is a non-education focus that we're dealing with here. The children mean much to our educrats. They demand our children become just like them. Our children are the wheat that has to be threshed, right? They are the clay that has to be molded. Without access to our kids, they're nothing. It is not a childless or unchild-centered curriculum. It is an anti-education curriculum. Ideology in the place of learning. Social justice in the way of truth and history. All that now is what we're doing here. And there's one complaint I have about the Donald Trump administration and his appointees like Betsy DeVos. Why are we 3.75 years into a 4-year term, but when we're now hearing about this? This is what has changed, Betsy, between now and 2016 when you took office? The answer is almost nothing. And same thing with the Durham report. You're just beginning to report on the malfeasance of the FBI and the Democrats a month and a half when, if you lose the election, you're never going to hear from us again. Why did they not start this 2 years ago? Absolutely maddening, and it makes you wonder if there's anybody in government you can trust. But at least Betsy DeVos, all credit she deserves for articulating and having realized what the problem is. Again, what are local school boards going to do about it, though, Betsy? Local school boards have no power thanks to Common Core, which you helped institute. So the schools aren't going to help you. And what exactly are their lawmakers in their local communities going to do? You think the Democrats who have a majority in the House, you think they're going to do anything? No. And you think a minority member of Congress has the power to do anything? We gave away the schools to corporate support and federal interest. Only at the federal level, Betsy, can you fix it. You're the highest ranking member of education in the country. You have to do more, Betsy, than just complain about it. You have to fix it.
So I'm happy to report that, when our school administrators are on their own time, they're out there in the streets yelling F the police, because that's what we should be doing with our off time. We have an assistant principal at a high school in a suburb of Rochester, New York, who decided to live stream himself attending a Black Lives Matter protest. It's we'll show you the clip, but don't worry, he manages in just about 50 seconds to say what a S-word, A-word job the Rochester Police Department has been doing, and to F the police, and that he says that the Rochester Police Department can F right off America, but he thanks them.
Good evening, folks. It's Steve Lysenko, president of the local chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education. In an act of protest this evening, we marched west on Court Street, and we didn't do anything but chant and sing all the way halfway across the bridge, at which point we met the Rochester Police Department, and guess what happened? Our peacekeepers ended up shooting pepper spray at us for singing and chanting and telling them what a job they were doing. They can right off, America. The police. Rochester Police Department. Thank you.
I just love the thank you. It's like Nelson from The Simpsons. As a matter of fact, I was sitting around the house the other day, I'm thinking to myself, because I have a lot of free time on my hands now. I'm thinking to myself, what would happen if Brian Stelter at CNN and George Costanza had a love child? I spent hours reflecting on this. Mike, show the picture. Yeah, so there, if you want to know what a love child between Brian Stelter and George Costanza looks like, there you have the picture. And I hate to play the whataboutism game, but can you imagine if you had a guy in his position at a local public school, went to a Blue Lives Matter rally and started screaming those things about Black Lives Matter as opposed to in support of it? Do you think he'd have a job today?
No, not in that case. But we've had stories on that. We've talked about the Blue Lives Matter and how if you even show up,
that's right,
make an appearance, they're trying to oust you.
And so this guy introduces himself, tells you his bona fides, right? The local chapter president of some multicultural association.
But he's also the 9th grade and academy assistant principal at Spencerport High School.
I just ask you to consider, Mom, if he said the same thing against Black Lives in defense of police, he would not have his job right now. There's absolutely no doubt about it that his free will is extended because his politics are left wing. This is the kind of imbalance. And if this is what's going on with your teachers and your vice principals, look at what kind of a box they put your kids in.
And this it's not a news story. I'll kind of phrase it like that. The reason they were protesting and they went all the way across that bridge, they were protesting the death of Daniel Prude, who's a 41-year-old black man. He died 7 days after he had an interaction with the Rochester Police Department. This was back in March, but we're just getting the story now. So now the outrage is there. And without going into the whole medical examiner's office, reasoning for death, asphyxiation, and all that stuff, he also may have been high on PCP. So there's a lot of reasons that he may have died, and basically, as is in all of these cases,
7 days after his encounter with the police.
So as is all of these cases that we've had, especially in 2020, involving police and then an arrestee. We don't know the full story until many moons later, and by then we've already burned down how many buildings and killed other people. All that stuff.
Hands up, don't shoot.
All of that.
Know, even Obama's own Department of Justice, led by the reprehensible Eric Holder, concluded that there was no such thing happened. There was no hands up, don't shoot. It was all a complete fabrication.
But of course, we have a school response, as we always do, and you interpret it for what it is. So the Spencerport Central School District responded to the comments made from the administrator in a statement posted to social media, because that's how we do it. It says, the district said it stands in solidarity in support of racial equality and systemic change. And they condemned the word choice of Lysenko, but they didn't actually name him directly. So Joe Biden did and said, I condemn rioting and looting in all forms, but wink, wink.
Right. Again, this is even worse than the typical one of these statements from the school. Basically like, wink, we don't like the F-bomb, but other than that, you go, girl.
It's time for some real education with my boy Jeremy Bentham, who was around from 1748 to 1832. He was an English philosopher, a jurist, a social reformer, and is considered the founder of modern utilitarianism. Bentham defined as the fundamental axiom of his philosophy the principle that it's the greatest happiness of the greatest number that's the measure of right and wrong. He became a leading theorist in Anglo-American philosophy of law and a political radical whose ideas influenced the development of welfarism.
Yeah, and Bentham is a really fraught guy. He gave us, as Katie said, utilitarianism, which I think is a morally wicked philosophy. It is the philosophy that says the greatest good for the greatest many is what is happiness. So if you ever found yourself in a situation that the only way you could make 1 million people happy and contented would be to murder 100,000 of them, that's the kind of moral calculus you have to engage in. And it's the spine, it's the backbone of welfarism and Western progressivism to this day. Welfarism is seeing human needs through the lens of welfare. What do people need to do what they want to do? You can see the origins of socialism in this. You could see 100 years after this, Karl Marx just seizing on welfarism as an idea, right? Like the 1619 curriculum funnels out everything that's not black slavery. So too in this particular story we're dealing with utilitarianism, it funnels out everything that impinges in any way on anything other than the immediate wants and needs and satisfactions of the individual. It is purely materialist. In fact, Bentham's own body, he decided to leave it to science, right? His body didn't believe in God, rejected the idea that our rights came from God or a creator. He donated his own body to public scientific dissection after he died. And then, so titanic was his ego, he wanted to leave his incredible body to his school. So take a look. There is the head of Bentham, which we still have to this day. The eyeballs, of course, are fake, but that's the actual mummified head of this very materialist philosopher. And you move on to the next image here. His body was taxidermically preserved. There is Jeremy Bentham under glass, and every year it's pulled out. Let me give you a sense of this here. On his death in 1832, Bentham left instructions for his body to be first dissected, then to be permanently preserved as an auto-icon, or self-image, which would be his memorial. This was done, and the auto-icon is now on public display in the entrance of the Student Center at University College London, UCL. Because of his arguments in favor of the general availability of education, he has been described as the spiritual founder of that college. However, he played only a limited direct part in its foundation. A man whose ideas gave rise to a lot of bad things in the world.
All right, just as a reminder, since Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are not being fans of our content, I can't imagine why, they have demonetized us, and we've decided to go right around them with our Patriot Club. So with a one-time $99 tax-deductible donation, we're going to send you this beautiful, lovely, and ever so handsome stainless steel tumbler as a thank you. All you have to do to get this sweet, sweet swag is go to patriotclub.us to get yours today. That's patriotclub.us. And now we're going to wrap things up with a fun fact of the day, because I said my boy Jeremy Bentham before, and it's because he's my boy. I went and saw him 3 different times, his auto icon. And then I went down to the pub after and had a pint for him, because they actually have a pub called the Jeremy Bentham Pub. Why did I do this? It's because I was in England and it was just fascinating. But here's the fun fact of the day. It's rumored that he actually carried those glass eyeballs that he has around in his pocket before his death for years, because he knew which eyeballs he wanted. And they do roll him out, they say, once a year, I don't know if they still do it, to have him attend a meeting where he is said to be present but not voting.
And that wraps up our show for today. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, my friends, stay educated.